Hi, my name's Justin Shelf, and I'm the founder and run our engineering team here at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Config Manager. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at applications and the different components that actually create an application. So things like an application deployment type, requirements, dependencies, supersedence. There's quite a few different items that make up an application. So in this video, I just want to give a good general understanding to make sure you understand how applications work and how we can create applications for EXE and MSI installers is going to be the goal of this video for me. Now, if you've been following my content, you may have noticed that I did do a deep dive into application deployment from a client-side perspective. So I realize now that it probably would have made more sense to do the general overview of how to create, manage, and deploy them first. So if you watch this video and you want a deeper look in and you haven't watched the deep dive from a client side, this might be a good follow-up video for you to check out. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and jump in. We do have a lot of content to cover in this video. So the first thing we're going to look at is creating a simple application. So this is going to be using a MSI or Windows installer. This is going to be the easiest, I would say, application that you can create and deploy within Config Manager because it can read a lot of the data required to detect whether that application is installed, the installation commands. A lot of things are common when you're using a MSI installer. So this is a Windows installer file type. So if we go ahead and click on Create Application, the first wizard that we're going to get here is whether we want to create a deployment type, which is actually how an application gets installed. So you can almost think of an application as just the metadata. So what's the application name? What's the version? What's the vendor? What's the icon that you want to use with it? More of the generic things. But the deployment type is actually how it gets installed. So where's the content? What's the command lines? Things like that. Okay, so within this application page, I'm going to go ahead and choose that I want to create the deployment type. So I've already pre-downloaded some content for 7-zip. So we're going to start by creating a 7-zip application. Now, if I look here, I've already downloaded the MSI. We can see that I do have both editions here. So I have the 32 and 64-bit installer for this. So we're just going to choose one of these since the initial application wizard will only provide us the ability to create one deployment type, but we're going to go through and create multiple different deployments, one for 32-bit operating systems and one for 64-bit, and we'll kind of review how we can do that. Okay, so clicking next, I can see that I get a notification saying the installer is not digitally signed. So 7-zip is open source. It's pretty common for open source projects to not always code sign their installer files. So I'm just going to do okay, and we'll ignore that for this product. Now, the next screen is going to be the metadata about the application itself. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to pause the video, and I'm just going to fill in some of the metadata around this application. All right, so I just filled in some of the metadata like the name, vendor, version, and description field here. Now, we can see that since this is an MSI installer, it did automatically give us the file name from that installer as well as /Q. So that's going to be a quiet installation for Windows installer. So it pre-filled in all the command lines that we need to install this. Now, I am going to say that I want to install this under system context so that it would run for all users, even if the user that initiates the installation within Software Center is not a full administrator. It will still install under the system context. And then optionally, if you did want to append any additional commands for the install, we can do that here. So just as an example, I'm going to add the reboot equals really suppressed. So that's going to mean it's never going to reboot the device. Even if it gives a reboot exit code, you can just have SCCM handle that in your deployment based on the return code, as well as we're appending the log parameter for MSI. So /L *V means verbose logging, and then the path where we want to save the log. So we're going to do temp %, temp% 7-zip install. So that's going to be under C Windows temp, since this is going to be installing under the system account on the device. So that's just optional if you wanted to add any additional Windows installer logs if you're using an MSI. If you just left /Q, that would be perfectly fine as well. Okay, so then we'll do next, and that's going to create the application for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that. We can now see that we have our application showing up in the console. Now, there are a few additional items that I want to add for the actual application or the metadata of the application. The first thing I'm going to say is that this can be installed using a task sequence in case you ever wanted to deploy that through a task sequence. Next, we're going to go over to the application catalog, and this is where we can add some additional filtering options and details that would be visible to the user within Software Center if they were to have this app as an available deployment for them. So the first thing that I'm going to add here is a new category. So we can see that I've already pre-created a few of these. So I'm going to assign the 7-zip as a archiver category for compression. So I'm going to just go ahead and add that. You can of course create new categories if you didn't have anything and you wanted to assign a category. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add the documentation URL. So if we go ahead and look at the user documentation, you could either browse out to a specific file, like if there was a help file, or you could just paste in a URL that the user could open directly from Software Center if this were to be shown. For the link text, I'll just call this documentation. And then optionally, if you wanted to add the privacy URL for this application, you could add that as well. So for this, I'll just paste out to the EULA for 7-zip. Now, we can also add keywords. These can be used to search within Software Center for applications. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this one. So we're going to add archiver, 7-zip, and zip that could be used as a keyword if the user were to search. And then lastly, the icon. So this can actually be quite helpful. It can make the end user display within Software Center look quite nice. So I'm gonna go ahead and add an icon file. So there's a few ways that we can do this. You could either browse out to a vendor website and download a icon file like a JPEG or a PNG, or we can actually extract the icon directly from an executable if you have an EXE for that application. So there's a few ways that we could do this. If the installer is a .exe, you could actually browse out and pull it from the installer if that's relevant for the product. The other thing is that you could browse out to a machine within the program files that has it already installed, and you could extract the icon from an EXE for that application. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose one of these that have the 7-zip icon, and then that's going to allow me to extract that icon. Now, when it extracts from the EXE, it might not be the highest resolution, so you may want to pull it from a website if you want high quality images, for example. Okay, that looks good, I think, for what I wanted to add just as general metadata for this application. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK for now. And then if we come back to the application, I'm going to click on the Deployment Types tab at the bottom. Now, if you remember, we did browse out and choose a MSI installer when we created the application. That was optional. If you wanted to just create the metadata and then create the deployment types after, we could have chosen that second radio box that says specify the deployment type information later. Now, for this one, we are going to rename that deployment type. So when it creates the MSI deployment type, it just gives it a generic name. So I don't like the name for this since we're going to have multiple. I want to make sure that's very descriptive. So I'm going to just go ahead and paste in the name here. And I'm going to name the deployment type just 7-zip, the version name, -MSI x64. And I think that's a bit better than what's just generically given when you create that from the MSI initial. All right, so jumping over to the Content tab, we can of course see it's pointing out to the path that we defined when we chose that MSI on the application creation. The next option, we're going to look at the command line. So we can see the command line that we created when we did the wizard initially, but we can also see, since this is an MSI, it also automatically gave us the uninstall command line using the product code that was detected within the MSI itself. So that looks good for what we have here. If we wanted to, we could also allow the repair to be done. So we could go ahead and browse out to the MSI file, and that's going to give the Windows installer code for it. So let's go ahead and browse out and choose OK. So if you allow your users to repair an application, you could get the product code and it could do that locally. Now you can also provide the MSI, so if it had to repair it from the cache, you could also go ahead and browse out and choose where the repair program would be for that as well. In our case, we'll just leave this just default for that, and we'll just use the product code here. But if you had like an EXE installer that we'll cover and you wanted to add a repair command, that's where you could run a program if you wanted. But just having the MSI, repairing it based on the product code should work fine for us in this scenario. All right, so the next tab we're going to look at is the detection method. So this is a big one. This is how Config Manager is going to detect whether the application is installed. So since applications are what we call state-based, meaning that Config Manager can detect whether they're there or not, we need to have some way to detect if that application is installed. So MSIs are by far the easiest one to add here because it can detect whether it's installed by reading the product code for that specific MSI file. So that's why a lot of these things for MSIs can be automated when we browse out to that MSI. And when we look at creating an EXE install, we'll see that we have to define a lot of these different attributes manually within the creation. So that looks okay. So we're just use the product code. Now, one scenario that you might want to do is if you have a application that may get updated outside of SCCM, you may want to add another condition here. Like if we click on add a new clause, where maybe we browse out and point where the application is installed. So I'm not sure if I actually have it here. Let's take a look. Let me see if it's on this Windows 10 device. There we go. So let's say we want to look out here and we'll browse out to a file. And we'll say the version greater than or equal to. And in this one, we actually want to do 19.60. So the one installed on that remote machine was actually newer. So what we could do in this scenario is do an OR condition. So what that means is that, let's say that this initial deployment is for 7-zip version 18.6. If we only use the MSI code, if a newer version was installed, it would not be detected as installed, and it could potentially try to reinstall if it was a required deployment. So if you had time and you wanted to add an OR condition where you could do like greater than or equal to, that may be a good idea for applications that are MSI based. Okay, so then going over to user experience, we want to make sure it's installed for system, whether or not a user is logged in, so we can see that looks good. Now, you may want to change the max runtime. So I'm going to make it 15. That's the lowest number. So 7-zip is so small. If it's not installed by 15 minutes, most likely you have some type of issue. So then it's going to stop monitoring and close out of the installation. So we're going to set that as the max runtime. For the estimated install time, we're just going to go ahead and put 1 minute in here for that. Restart behavior, by default, it's going to be based on the return code of the install. So 0 would be success, 3010 would be restart needed, and then 1641 would be a restart's been initiated. So if you want to just leave the defaults, SCCM will determine whether a restart should be prompted based on the return code, or if you want to always require a restart, there's a few different options here where you can configure how you want restarts to be handled within this install. We're just going to leave it based on the exit code. All right, so next we want to look at the requirements. So these are things that have to be met in order for this application to be applicable, or I should say this deployment type of the application to be applicable. So since this is a 64-bit specific install, what we're going to use here is a condition for the operating system, and we're going to say that it needs to be 64-bit. So I'm going to choose all Windows 7 64-bit. I'm going to do 8.1 64-bit. And then Windows 10 64-bit. Now, of course, you could do server operating systems if you wanted, just pretty much anything that would be applicable. In our case, it would be, 64-bit operating systems would be required since this is a 64-bit install for this product. So we're going to make that a requirement. So this would only be applicable and show up, even if you deploy it to a collection that contains 32-bit machines, this would never show up unless it's actually a 64-bit OS for the user or device that we're targeting the application to. Return codes, we're going to just leave everything default. Here's where we can see some of those default return codes. If you had any custom return codes that this installer would provide, you could add those here if needed. And then dependencies, we'll look at this a little bit later on, but there's no dependencies that we need for 7-zip. All right, so that looks good. So we have our 64-bit deployment type, or our installer essentially is what that deployment type is. Now what we want to do within this same application, we're going to right click and choose to create another deployment type. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And we're going to get the same type of wizard that we got before. So for this one, we're going to browse out and we're going to point to the 32-bit version of this application now. So we're just going to browse out, point to that MSI file and choose next here. That's going to go ahead and import some information. I'm going to go ahead and just copy the deployment type name that I want to use for the 32-bit. There we go. We'll install for system. I'll copy that command line that I used for the reboot, really suppress, as well as the log file, and then we'll do next here. Requirement. So we can go ahead and add this directly in the wizard if we want here. So I'm going to go ahead and do operating system. And then we're just going to do the 32-bit version of those operating systems that we did previously. And there we go. So we'll do next here, no dependencies, and then next here. So if we go ahead and look at this, we can now see that we have two different deployment types. We have the 64-bit one as well as the 32-bit one. By default, when a evaluation is happening to see if any deployment types for the application match, it will go in the priority order. So for example, it would say, is the 64-bit deployment type applicable? If it's not, it would then go to the second priority, which would be the 32-bit. So if there are multiple deployment types that you're using that would meet the criteria, the priority of those deployment types that you added would be precedent. Then it will look at those requirement rules to see if they actually meet. So if we go ahead and look at this, we can see that we'll just change a few things here. So we'll do 15 minutes and then 1 minute for the estimated. Detection method, we can see that it's got the product code. Optionally, if you wanted to add the file system or registry values as an OR condition greater than or equal to, we could certainly add that here as well. I'm going to go ahead and browse out and choose our repair code here and then apply. Okay, I think that's good. There is this option here for the install behavior. If you wanted to search out and validate that no executables are running prior to the install, and you can optionally close them out when you create your deployment. So for example, you could say 7z.exe should not be running when this install takes place. You could add that, and if the file is running, it would either prompt the user to close it, depending on whether you choose to auto close or prompt. So this feature might be helpful if you're aware of a application that could cause issues if it's in use. But other than that, I think we have everything filled out that we want for this 32-bit deployment type, and we should be good to go here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and deploy this application. So I'm going to choose deploy on it. We're going to do a user collection, and I'm just going to deploy this to all users. So I've already set up discovery for my users. If you haven't done that yet, you can check out my second video, the post configuration guide, and that will cover how you can configure discovery for users and devices. In our case, we're just going to target this to all users, and I'm going to distribute it to my all distribution point group within SCCM here. I'm going to leave it as an available installation. So that means the user would actually have to force this within Software Center if they wanted this product. So it's going to be kind of a catalog, and I'm going to allow my users to browse out and see this application. If you wanted to require an approval for the application, you could enable that option, and you can even set email addresses that would be notified whenever somebody requests for an approval before they could install it. I'm going to leave just the defaults there. I'm going to show only notifications for restarts in this scenario. And I'm going to leave the defaults for alerts. All right, so next we're going to look at creating an application for a product that uses an EXE installer. So this one's going to be a little bit more complex and time consuming just because we can't automatically pre-fill a lot of that detection information based on the MSI. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a new application, and then when we're using an EXE installer, we're going to choose to manually specify the application information. So I'm going to go ahead and choose next here. And I'm just going to fill out some of the metadata. So we're going to use Notepad++. So I'm just going to pause it while I fill this out. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and click next. And now I'm going to go ahead and fill out the application catalog details. So I'm going to classify this as an editor. I'm going to then paste in some of the details, and we'll come back once I have this filled in. All right, so I filled in some of the metadata for the application catalog. I'm going to choose next here. And now this is where we can come in and create our deployment type. So I'm going to go ahead and choose it to add a new deployment type. So that's going to be where we point out to the installer. But for this time, we can see that there's no built-in deployment type for an EXE. So for example, it's not an MSI, it's not AppX, it's not any of these mobile application types. So what we need to choose if we're using an EXE, or even if you have like a wrapper script, like a PowerShell script that does your installs, we need to choose a script installer in this scenario where it's not an MSI and it's an EXE installer. So we're going to choose next here. I'm then going to fill in my deployment type name. So this is going to be the 32-bit installer for Notepad++. We're just going to configure the 32-bit version just because sometimes there's compatibility issues if you go with the full 64-bit and you're using external plugins. So we're going to just create a deployment type for the 32-bit version of Notepad++. So I'm going to go ahead and browse out to my content. So I've already pre-downloaded the Notepad++ installer. So if we go ahead and look here, I'm going to choose that 32-bit version for the content and then OK on that. All right, so if we browse out to the install program, I can go ahead and select the installer. Now, what we need to know here is that for an EXE, you need to actually find out what the silent command line is. So a lot of installers may use something like a /s, /quiet, /very silent, but you need to figure out how you can actually deploy this silently. So you can use the search engine of your choice. So we've got both up here. And then what I'm doing is just searching just the Notepad++ site. So I've got a site filter, and then I just search for silent install. So looking at the vendor site may be a good place to start. If you don't find it there, you could just remove that and just do a generic search for something like Notepad++ silent install. If I go ahead and look at the first result here, we can see that, this is one of their forums. Somebody was asking how we can do a quiet installation, and it looks like Notepad++ uses /S. So if we go ahead and browse out, I'm going to go ahead and just type that in for my silent command line. So you're just going to have to determine this. Now, some installers may allow you to question mark to determine what command lines are available. So I believe FileZilla is one that we can run a question mark on. So let me just go ahead and browse out here and just give you an example. So it may be a good idea just to run this if you're not sure what the exe install command is. You can see if the installer provides a prompt for /question. It looks like 7-zip actually does not. I think I was thinking of KeyPass. So let's go to KeyPass. We'll run a question mark on their installer. And then we can see this is one that does give us command lines. So we can see for a silent installation, we can use /very silent, as well as just quite a few additional options that you can configure within the installation for this exe installer. All right, so now for the uninstall command, you will have to determine what the silent uninstall command is if you want to allow the option to uninstall this application. Now, this is optional, but it's probably a good idea if you can find it. In our case, we already know what it is, so we're just pointing out to the program files. Now, note, this is pointing out directly to the 32-bit version program files on a 64-bit OS. So my whole lab environment is 64-bit, so this should work perfectly fine. But if you were installing this 32-bit version on a 32-bit OS, the uninstall would most likely be here in just the normal program files. So keep that in mind. If you were in a multi-architecture environment, you may have to create like a script file that has a little bit more logic than just looking at a specific location for the uninstall command, for example. So we're just looking at the Notepad install, uninstall, and then /s to make it quiet. All right, so this looks good. Now, for the detection method, this is where we need to get a little bit creative for EXEs. Since it can't automatically create the detection method from reading the product code of an MSI, for example, you need to determine how we can actually find out if this application is installed on a device. So what I'm going to do is on the server that I'm running, I've actually already got Notepad++ installed, so we can actually browse out to the registry and I can show you where the information lives for Notepad++. So if we look here under software, so local machine, software, and then Microsoft, Windows, and then current version. So let's see if we can get there really quick. Windows, current version, and then the uninstall tab. This is going to be where installations generally get installed to, and this is where add and remove programs also install to on a device. So what we can see here is that it doesn't exist on the main HKey local machine software Microsoft. So what that means is if we look at this, it's actually a 64-bit OS. So if we want to see if there's a 32-bit application installed on a 64-bit OS, it's going to be under the WoW 6432 node. So if we look under there and then go to Microsoft, and then Windows current version uninstall. Now, if you did have a 64-bit application that's a native 64-bit installer, it would exist under the main Microsoft key and you wouldn't go to this redirected key. But since I believe 7-zip or let's see, Notepad++, let's take a look here. All right, so here we go. I found it. I just had to reinstall it. I think I must have removed it. So in the uninstall key, we can see that since Notepad++ is an EXE, a lot of times you'll see that they use the same common registry key name for their install. So what we can do here is we can look at this DisplayVersion value within this registry key. So I'm going to go ahead and choose on that key and then choose OK here. Now, what we can see is that this one did append that 32-bit syswow key since it's a 32-bit install. We're going to want to remove that. And then we're going to want to check this box that says it's a 32-bit application on a 64-bit OS. What that means is that if it's a 32-bit OS, it will just natively search for the native Hive. But if it detects it's a 64-bit OS, it will automatically append that WoW 6432 node. So we want to take that out if you did browse to it on a 64-bit OS for a 32-bit app. And then instead, we want to choose this option here that it's a 32-bit app. We're then going to choose the version value, and we're going to say the registry must be equal than or greater to. So here we go, greater than or equal to 7.66, and that's the version that will get installed with this EXE installer. So that's going to be the detection method that we use for this EXE that we're using here. Now we could also do things like file. So let's say you wanted to look at program files. So we'll look at program files, Notepad++, and then we can look at the core executable here. So let's do the version must be greater than or equal to, and then the version that we currently detected on this device. Now, since this is in fact a 32-bit application, we can see that it automatically appended program files x86. So we should be able to remove program files here and then just choose this is a 32-bit application on a 64-bit OS, and that should be able to redirect it. So it will only look at the main program files for 32-bit operating systems, and then it would redirect to program files x86 for a 64-bit OS where this 32-bit app is installed. Let me actually do greater than or equal to. I must not have saved that, and then OK. And you can see that I ORed these conditions. So if the registry key exists or the file exists, we're going to say that this application is installed. User experience, we're going to install for the system context whether or not a user is logged in. We're going to say the max runtime is 15 minutes. Estimated install time is also just going to be a minute. This is a very quick, small install for Notepad++. Requirement, since we want to allow this to install in 32 or 64-bit, we can essentially leave that blank. If you wanted to set it so it could only go on certain operating systems or certain memory limits, you could certainly come in here and you could add different requirements based on that application. But Notepad++ is pretty lightweight and really shouldn't have too much with regards to requirements or dependencies here. So we'll choose next here and then close. Do next and then next. All right, so we've got our application, we've got our deployment type. If I click on the application, I think I've got pretty much everything filled out from that initial dialog. I will check this box to allow it to be installed from a task sequence in case I wanted to deploy this during imaging. We can see that we've got our icon and all our metadata put in here. I think that should be good. We've got our deployment type for the actual install, and we should be good to go here. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here where I target this as available to all users. So I'll pause it while I create this deployment just like we did with 7-zip. Okay, next we're going to go ahead and create an application for Google Chrome. This is also a MSI file, so this should be pretty easy to create. Now I'm just going to go ahead and choose to manually specify the information, and I'll show you how we could just create a generic application, and then we can come back and create the deployment types later. So we're going to go ahead and just do Google Chrome. I'm going to include the version file here, and I'll pause it while I complete this metadata. Okay, here we go. I'm going to choose next on this. And then we're going to fill in the metadata for the application catalog, which is what users would see here as well. All right, so that looks good for my metadata. We'll do next here. We'll leave the deployment type empty, and we'll create that after this. So we go ahead and do close. We can see that we just have the generic application. We don't even have any deployment types that we could actually deploy. Let's go ahead and do properties, and let's take a look if we need to change anything after the fact. So we're going to allow our task sequence. We can see that it looks like it may not actually allow me to set this until I create a deployment type that's set for system install. So we'll come back to this setting. Everything else that looks good for our catalog, deployment type. So I can actually come in here. We'll create the deployment type directly from this tab. So for Chrome, it does also have a 32 and 64-bit installation. So if we come back to our installer here, I've already pre-downloaded this. So we have the 64-bit MSI, and I'll go ahead and browse out and do next here. Do next here. I'm going to just rename this to be the version name as well as MSI and 64-bit so we know which deployment type this is. Okay, I'm also going to append that reboot, really suppress, as well as the log file command line. And just take that 7 out of there for Chrome install. That looks good. Do next here. Requirements, let's just say this needs to be a 64-bit OS since this is specific for 64-bit. All right, so I selected the 64-bit OSs that I want to make this requirement for. We'll do next here. Dependencies, we'll leave that empty for now and then choose next. There we go. And I'm going to repeat this process for the 32-bit MSI for Chrome as well, and we'll pause it while I complete that process. All right, so we have our two deployment types. I should be able to come back in here and allow it to be installed through a task sequence and then do OK on that. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at are dependencies. So what I'm going to do is create another application, and we're going to create a new application for Flash Player for Google Chrome. So I'm going to go ahead and browse out, and I've already pre-downloaded the Flash Player MSI. So the version that's applicable for Chrome is going to be Flash Player PPAPI. That's going to be the Chrome edition of their installer for Flash. So I'm just going to go ahead and browse out to that MSI and choose next here. We'll do next here. Let me just rename this to be a little bit more details here, and I'll pause it while I complete this. All right, so I filled that in. I also added my command line for reboot equals suppress as well as my log file for this MSI. We'll do next here and then next here. Here we go. We'll go ahead and check our task sequence box, and I'm just going to go ahead and fill in our metadata for our application catalog, which is what the user will see here in Software Center. All right, so that looks good. Let's go ahead and look here. I think we've got pretty much everything filled out. I will rename this deployment type that we created. Let's call that Flash Player for Chrome. This isn't architecture specific, so this will work on a 32 or 64-bit OS, so I don't need to worry about including that. Just do -MSI though. Okay, I think just about everything else should probably be good. We can go ahead and add the repair code if we wanted here. So let me just browse out to that MSI. Grab that code. Detection, we'll just leave it for the installer product code. That should be okay for this. Whether or not a user's logged in, this all looks good. Let's also do 15 minutes here. Expected install, we'll do 3 minutes for that. Requirements, that all should be good. And we are all set here, and then I'll do okay on that. All right, so we're going to come back to Chrome, and I'm going to go ahead and do properties of my application. And then we're going to click on the, actually we want to go to deployment types within the application. And I'm going to go ahead and choose my 64-bit Chrome MSI installer deployment type. And then we're going to click on dependencies. So dependencies are things that would have to be installed prior to the application being installed that we're looking at for the deployment type. So what we're going to do in this scenario, we're going to say that we want to make sure that Flash Player for Chrome is installed as a dependency. So this could be a lot of different scenarios. I think .NET would probably be the most common one where you may have to add that as a dependency for an application. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that I want my Flash Player for Chrome to be my dependency for my Chrome 64-bit MSI. So I'm gonna go ahead and choose that deployment type we created for the Flash plugin for Chrome, and then do OK on that, and set that as a dependency, and then OK. We can see we set auto install to yes. That means that it's gonna automatically install it if it's not there. If you didn't have this set to yes and the dependency was not installed, it would just not attempt to install this because the requirements would not be met. We'll also do Flash x86. And then we're going to set the same dependency here for Flash Player. So we're going to say the 32-bit version of Chrome as well as the 64-bit deployment type all are going to be a dependency here. Actually, nope, let me delete that. We'll do OK. And then apply that for just the 64-bit deployment type of Chrome. To set it on the 32-bit, we need to go back into the 32-bit deployment type, and then we'll add that dependency for Flash directly in that 32-bit MSI for the deployment type. So we'll just do the same thing here. We're going to point out to Flash, and then point to the Flash MSI deployment type, and then choose OK, and add that as a dependency. All right, I think that looks good. Now I'm just going to go ahead and distribute the content for all these applications just to make sure that all the content is available for my clients when we attempt to install these. So I'm just going to select all 4 of these apps that we made and then choose to distribute the content to all my distribution points using my group. All right, so we've already deployed 7-zip and Notepad++, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat that deployment, and I'm going to keep all users for my target collection, and I'm going to deploy Chrome as well as Flash Player. All right, so those applications were all deployed. Now I did make one change on my deployment for Notepad++. I am enabling the option that it requires approval in order for this to actually be installed on the device. So if you require approval, you're going to get a notification that you need to approve it either in the console, or if you enable the email address within your deployment, you can get emailed about new application requests from your users. So jumping over to one of my devices, I'm going to go ahead and open up Software Center. So since these are all available deployments that we did to a user collection, we would actually have to initiate these through Software Center. Now we can of course make these required if you wanted to force these to install on your devices that you target as well. Now since we did do user deployments, the classifications that we defined in the app catalog are going to show up for any user deployments here. So we could even filter by all these different options like archivers. We can see 7-zip, or depending on, if you had a large catalog, this could be quite helpful. Now the first one we're going to look at is 7-zip. So this was pretty basic, right? This was just an MSI. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. It should just initiate the install right away. It doesn't require any approval. Now to actually review the application installation, it's going to be in the appenforce.log on the client side. So this is where we can actually see the install taking place. Now in my deep dive video for applications, we cover this in much more detail, but here's where we can see the details about the MSI as well as the command lines that are being run. So let's just do a quick look here. We can see that it did in fact expand that command line for the log file for the temp directory, and it put it in C Windows temp. So let's take a quick look and see if we can actually find that install file for 7-zip. So here's the actual verbose logging because we added that log parameter for MSIs, for example. So that looks like it worked perfectly fine here. All right, so let's go back and let's go ahead and initiate the installation for Chrome. Now what we're going to see here is that since we had a dependency, it's going to install both Chrome as well as the Flash Player. So here we go. We can see that we have 2 items remaining if we actually look at this install progress. So if we take a look at that appenforce.log, we can see that's going to start initially by installing that dependency for Flash Player. We can also see that it's creating the log file. So if we look in C Windows temp, we can find that Flash Player install file name that I defined in my log. That all looks like it was successful. And now we can see that it's running the Chrome install, and we can also validate that we included the log for Chrome as well. There we go, Chrome install.log. Here's the MSI that we created for that as well. Looks like that completed. So if we come back here, we can see that we have both 7-zip as well as Google Chrome installed. Now, if we come back to our application and we look at Notepad++, we can see that this one is requiring us to get approval because that was set within the deployment. So let's go ahead and make a request. And we can see that that was submitted. Now, if I come back into my console, I did not enable email notifications directly, so this is just going to show up within my console. We can see things about the user that requested this, and I'm going to go ahead and say I want to approve it. Now, if you enabled emails, you could approve these directly from that email as well. Cool. So we'll get that approved. And what we should notice here on the client side, it will take a little bit. But once that's approved, we should see that we'll be able to install it now that it's been approved. And this would automatically install as well once it detected that change, but we can see that we can now force that to install directly here. And then we can see that that's now complete. Now, if I go ahead and refresh my registry, let's go ahead and just take a look at what actually happened here. So here's that Notepad++. We can see that it is in fact on that WoW 6432 node, since it's a 32-bit app on a 64-bit OS. And of course, we can see that this is in fact what our detection method is using. It's using that display version that we defined here. So that's why everything detected successfully for this EXE installer, and everything looks good for these 3 apps that we did. All right, so the next thing I want to look at is supersedence. So what I'm going to do on the back end here, I don't think there's any need to record this part, but we're going to create a new application just like we did for 7-zip version 1806, but we're going to create an application for the latest version, which is 19.00. So I'll pause it while I create that application. All right, so we can now see that I've created a new application for the latest version of 7-zip, version 19.00. So we're going to go ahead and click on that application and then do properties. Now from here, we're going to click on the supersedence tab, and what we're going to do, we're going to supersede the previous version that we had an application for. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that version 18.06. Now within the supersedence, we can see the old deployment types in the old application, and we can choose whether we want to replace them with new deployment types for that supersedence. So I'm going to say that I want to map my 64-bit MSI from my old version of the app deployment type to the new one, and we're going to do the same thing for the 32-bit deployment type. Now optionally, we have this option where we can say that we want to trigger the uninstall of the previous deployment type if that was provided. Now in our case, it's not required because 7-zip will cleanly upgrade the previous MSI without having to run the uninstall command. This could be like if you're doing a major version migration and maybe the upgrade doesn't auto remove previous versions, or you want to migrate to a new product, you could use the uninstall option to trigger the uninstall command of the previous application's deployment type that you've mapped in the event that you need to manually trigger that uninstall during the new version upgrade. But we shouldn't have to do that with 7-zip. It will cleanly upgrade. So we'll do OK on that, and we'll choose yes for that supersedence. Next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and deploy this application to all users just like we did previously. So I'm going to go ahead and choose next. We're going to do all users here. I've already distributed the content for this new version. Now here's a setting that will show up if we detect that this application has another application that's been superseded. You're going to get this checkbox that says, do you want to automatically upgrade any superseded versions? I'm going to choose yes on that. What that means is that if a user installed a previous application, it will automatically upgrade that application, even if it's just an available deployment. If you choose this option, it will still perform the upgrade automatically, and we can choose as soon as possible where it can upgrade the superseded version. If you wanted to make it only upgrade after a certain date, we can also configure that as well, but I'm going to say we want to make it upgrade right away. I'll leave the default for notifications and then default for everything else, and then choose close. So there's a few things that we'll notice. We can still see the previous application is still deployed to all users, but since we set it as superseded, and when we deploy the new application, we're not going to show that previous one because we set it so that it's not going to show the superseded application anymore in Software Center. It would only show the latest version of that application. So if we come back to our application here and look at that supersedence rule, we can see that we did not enable the option to show the previous version that superseded. So in the event that you have a newer version that's superseding an older one, as long as you don't check this box, only the newest version should be displayed in Software Center. So this might take a second for policy to kick in, but we can actually see that this is already only showing version 19 on this server. Now, if we come back to our client, let's take a quick look. It probably hasn't picked up policy yet, so I'll pause it and we'll wait to see if this one automatically upgrades because we chose that option here. There we go. So I can see the installation just automatically triggered for the new version after running a few policy cycles. And we can now see that it's automatically upgraded, and I didn't even have to manually trigger that because I enabled that checkbox. We can of course see in the log file, we can see the new MSI taking place. And if we refresh add and remove programs, what we should see here is that we have the latest version. So here's version 19. And of course we have the other apps that we installed for Chrome, Flash, as well as Notepad++, 32-bit. So that all looks good. So jumping back to the server, I think that that's really all I had to cover today. So applications are a big topic. There's a lot of areas that even in this video I wasn't able to cover. So if you do have any questions, please make sure to leave a comment in the comment sections below or leave a comment on the blog post that will be accompanying. Thank you for watching.